Stop the Week with Robert Robinson.
Hello, our conversation this evening comes from Anne Leslie, the journalist, Edward Blishen, the writer, Stephen Oliver, the composer, and Laurie Taylor, Professor of Sociology at York University. We have music from Instant Sunshine. Now, quite the most arresting piece of social history I've ever heard, ever in my life, is that George V's doctor speeded up his death to spare him the appalling solecism of having the news appear first in the Evening Standard rather than the Times. The King, as you remember, was ushered into eternity an hour or so early via a syringe full of morphine and cocaine in the interests of protocol and precedence. And one rather hopes God wasn't put out by his distinguished guest arriving rather more than punctually. No, not at all. Let me get you a drink. I perfectly understand. Where the devil's the woman with the harp? She'll give you a tune while I get back to the kitchen for a minute. Now, dying peacefully is one thing, but dying politely is a very new concept.
It reminded me of that Henry James, who clearly decided that if he was to die, he was going to be dying in the best company. Now, you can't always guarantee that. So occasionally when he had to go to parts of London, which were not parts of London where persons of quality were naturally found, he used to stuff his pockets with invitations from the great and grand hostesses of London, so that if he was run down by an omnibus and he was killed, people who were rescuing him would find in his pockets something saying the Dowager Duchess of something or other is at home, etc., because he really felt that he could not die with people thinking he was just another road statistic.
Yes, concerns about how people might think of you after you're dead were nicely caught a couple of years ago when someone I had known for some time, who was a doctor, was visiting some friends and had a rather heavy supper and went to bed. I learnt this later, some months later, after they'd recovered from the shock of it all. But during the night, he woke up and realised that he was having some sort of coronary attack, and managed, nevertheless, to write on a piece of paper the exact words, "I'm terribly sorry about all this," and then he lay back and died. The necessity of feeling that he should apologise to his host and hostess for them discovering him in the morning during his weekend visit dead.
Oh, no, that has true charm. There's nothing bizarre about
that. But it is an event that calls up politeness, I think. What I notice about, by the way, about George V is that Lord Dawson of Penn, in his diary, called him patient with a capital P. The patient with a capital P. But
would you not have hoped so?
Oh, certainly. But I know I'm going to be a small P patient forever. But a friend of mine was telling me about a cremation he was present at, where the corpse was named by the wrong Christian name, which happens quite frequently. It happened in my father's case. But in this case, somebody actually intervened and said, so the parson said, "Richard," and a voice from the congregation said, "Robert." And, of course, it turned the whole cremation into a kind of lesson. The crematorium became a schoolroom, and everybody was very nervous, and the entire funeral, if I can put it like this, was spoiled.
Oh, no. But that's another human one.
Irrational social behaviour is wholly appropriate in the face of something so absolute as death. I rather approve of that. Edward will be able to specify a moment in a Thomas Hardy novel where a woman has kept all her life 4 heavy pennies to put on her eyes after she's dead, and someone else pinches them, saying, "Why should death rob life of 4pence?" But in a way, I rather approve of the lady who pinches them, but in my heart, I feel that the lady who wanted them on her eyes is the right.
The closest I ever came to this sort of post-mortem good breeding was something an aunt of mine, who was a billeting officer during the war, told me. She had to visit houses at all sorts of hours, unusual hours, and there was a wake going on at one place, and instead of leaving her standing on the doorstep, they invited her in, and my aunt said she was very surprised when the corpse sat up in the coffin and, as it were, greeted her. And what they'd done, they'd tied a cord round the corpse's neck and onto the door handle. The door opened outward, you're there before me, and every time a new guest came into the wake, they received a personal greeting. And my aunt thought this was a rather nice touch. Well, here's another oddity. Residents of Epsom recall it, driven to distraction by the voice of the lady announcer on Epsom station crying, "This is Epsom, this is Epsom, this is Epsom, all change, this is Epsom." And a chap nearby brought a private prosecution under the Control of Pollution Act to get it stopped, and he succeeded. And people said wounding things about the lady's voice, such as that it was strident and plummy, and the lady's name is Angela Peabody. Not Peabody, Peabody, which somehow doesn't help. And now they're getting a man announcer, and I just wondered, I thought I'd seize this opportunity to get a final verdict on whether the female voice is, in some absolute sense, more irritating than a man's.
And I am struck dumb, you see, because I can see...
Well, I can see it's a bit awkward.
I may say, I don't see how a voice can be both strident and plummy. I feel that they're actually...
No, but it's clear they didn't like her.
No, they didn't like it. No, I think that's quite true. A lot of people don't like women's voices, partly because I think they're all frightened of mummy or something. And a lot of the women's voices they hear which annoy them are women's voices in authority, like Mrs. Thatcher or the lady on Epsom station telling them to change trains. And they feel like little boys who are being ticked off before bedtime. I think that's it. I think it all goes down to potty training, as you know. I've always thought everything is to do with potty training. And I think the poor little boys have grown up into poor, frightened little men, and they don't like women's voices for that reason.
Right.
Now,
so
I'm going to
in
let you have your prejudices.
So it's all got up by the press.
It's all got up really by Freud.
Right-wing capitalist.
Now, Steve.
I mean, clearly, I could be really boring about this and tell you how the upper partials of the harmonics... Well, I shall be, in fact. So you may as well sit back and listen.
I think we put a fine edge on Anne, and I didn't mean to. Go on, Steve.
I was merely going to say that it would be tedious to describe how the female voice being higher up in the harmonic spectrum than the male voice is naturally more irritating. It's just bound to be that, and it's why sopranos and tenors, the high voices in opera, are given the exciting parts because they have the strenuous, thrilling things to do. But the English, who don't actually like music at all, they only like what music does. They like what they love are the low voices, the Kathleen Ferriers, the Janet Bakers, the Norma Proctors, the Owen Brannigans. That's who they think, because I think Anne is also is right in saying that they remind them primarily of mum.
Come
but
on,
people are
someone
thinking
else.
really of extremes, I think, because a woman may talk in her bonnet, as it were, up there, but a man may well talk in his boots, because I listened to our announcer on a local station recently, and what he was saying was this: we anathematize masochists, that the flawed beehive to willing God and sooty is rummy pox and pity fireman's slate. I listened to that very carefully because everybody on the platform looked at each other and waited for translations and tried to help each other. Actually, I knew what he said. He said, we advise passengers at the 4:45 to Welwyn Garden City is running approximately 5 minutes late. But in fact, he had one of those deep men's voices that were in the boots and were therefore terribly irritating. I mean, the greatest irritation of a voice of that nature is that you cannot understand what it says, so you wonder what on earth is going to happen.
Yeah, I must be clear. You say there's nothing in this business about the woman's voice being absolutely more irritating.
No.
And the other thing is whether it is single or whether it is collective, because perhaps if there are occasions when the single woman's voice, and I rather agree with Anne, because if you look at those, the number of letters which come into the BBC complaining about women's voices, the number of those which include references to school marmy and the statement that, who does she think she is telling us what to do? It exactly fits Anne's thesis. But the second thing is that perhaps, if individually that causes irritation, is there anything more irritating than the sound of large numbers of men all talking together? I mean, the sound of that mutually...
Yes, there is.
That
large numbers of women.
No. Go into somewhere like the Garrick Club, and hear sort of 50 men preening their egos, that self-congratulatory noise which they make.
Whereas at the Groucho Club, all is silent. It's like a library.
At least
a cloister.
Oh, I knew he'd go. Here he is. Here is a member of this tribe who lean on the bar, making this noise from time to time.
If ever I heard a native Groucho member, I have just heard him.
The sound of their own voices extremely soothing, and why they find the voices of women intrusive is literally because they are intrusive.
Well, you see,
they're
I only asked the
intruding
question.
into a kind of club.
And immediately the defensive hackles have risen.
I'm
now,
expected to be defensive on this,
no,
she says, lowering her
lady
voice.
politicians have not done all they might have done to put it beyond a conjecture that women's voices were just as nice as men's. I mean, you remember the mannish tones of Lady Summerskill? Her voice would fall like a timber athwart any topic. Jenny Lee, a very pleasing Scottish voice, but with a hint of rebuke always there. I remember her addressing the Evening Standard Drama Awards, and a lot of sophisticated glitterati were there, Sir Lawrence Oliver, Sir Alex, Sir Ralph, and all of those. And she began by saying, I will not imitate the accents because I cannot. She began by saying, "Oh, you show folk, you're either up up in the air or down in the dumps. And it didn't go down too well with Sir Alex, Sir Ralph, and Sir Lawrence.
These are absolute paranoias we're hearing here. I find this extremely distressing. It's clear that the lower the voice... I don't agree with Edward at all. It's clear that all great actresses have low voices. I had to teach once Janet Sussman how to sing a song and discovered that her range is exactly that of Placido Domingo, a tenor, a male voice, and very beautiful her voice is,
But
too.
you know, the reason why actresses have low voices is the same reason, really, as Italian women have low voices. All Italian women are contraltos, if not double basses, is because they have to shout from an early age, and that lowers the voice and damages the vocal cords. But going back to what you were saying about the women politicians, I think it's very interesting that the only woman politician whose voice is not complained about is Shirley Williams. And it's because she has got a rather sweet, gentle,
She's got a nice voice. Too cool.
No, the reason it's a nice voice, if you actually listen to it compared with any other woman politician, it's not that. It's because she seems slightly scatty and therefore feminine and not to be taken seriously.
She
doesn't make people think that she's schoolmarm.
She's got a warm contralto, and of course Mrs. Thatcher has tried to bevel the edges of her own native delivery and try and approximate that particular one. But as they say, you can get the girl out of Grantham, but can you get Grantham out of the girl? That's the difficult
what a
bit.
snob you are, as well as
Not
a
really.
We're still at the
Just an old
stage.
saying. But the really burning question is, what's wrong with Sid? Everyone knows there's something wrong with Sid. Nobody wants to be mistaken for Sid, and it's not just that Sid's a sheephead, it's something about the name as well. I think I'd almost sooner be Len, or even Les, than Sid, wouldn't you?
No. I just think that this Sid, we are, of course, folks, talking about the gas advertisement, in case you wonder,
I don't think anyone will.
Is the ne'er-do-well of a member of the Rothschilds, because the Rothschilds are flogging this thing.
Sidney Rothschild is the one?
Sid Rothschild,
I see.
in my view, is the one who became the car mechanic and didn't go into banking. And that's why they're keeping him under wraps.
Sidney Rothschild. That was worth waiting for. Now, come on.
The point is
your
there are
middle
no-
name isn't Sid, is it Ted?
No, it isn't, Bob. It isn't really. No, I'm just struck down because I still cannot work out why Sid is so terribly unattractive. Though, in fact, I've known one or two attractive Sids who were born... Actually, if you have a very unattractive name like Sid, if you have a very unattractive, and you are very attractive, then I think your having a very unattractive name makes you even more attractive than if you hadn't got an unattractive name. Is that all right?
Yes, I follow
see what
you perfectly.
So actually, if you are triumphantly a magnificent, charismatic Sid, you are better than it's better than having the most noble name in the world, like Lawrence, say, or something of that name.
Right.
Laurie, are you a Lawrence, really?
Yes, I am a Lawrence, but you see, now, if you became a Sid, if you could only start out as a Sid, if this thing hadn't stopped, if it hadn't excluded the possibility of anybody being a Sid now, because if you look at the statistics on that, in 1850,
Which I'm glad someone
there were
has.
34 out of every 100,000 people. It reached a peak in 1900 in the history of this country. It's the highest point it was ever reached. There were 155 people per 100,000 of the population who had the right to call themselves Sid. In 1975, it shared with Harold, Cyril, and Fred, naught. No one was being named Harold, Cyril, Fred, or Sid in 1975. An amazing thing. Now, this, in normal
Very
circumstances,
interesting.
would mean that next year it could come straight back in again, because these names follow, as we know from all the analysis of them, this cyclical thing. But this, of course, has ruined it.
But I wanted to know, you see,
names,
why this particular Sid is so appalling. You see, and I'll give you my theory for want of a
give you
better.
mine.
I see,
We can all give you
being the chairman, I give you my theory first. You can chime in afterwards. My theory is that when it comes to finance and investment and that sort of thing, we all of us secretly fear that we're a jolly sight closer to Sid than we are to Nigel. And I put this a little to the test, though not knowingly, when I spoke to our friend Michael O'Donnell at lunch, and I gave him some very sound advice about the stock market. And all he did was burst into a peal of laughter. And it was as though he thought I could throw light on atomic particles as easily as I could devise a financial strategy. And the thing is, I now know how Sid feels. Sid knows he's Nigel. If only people would stop laughing long enough. They never do.
But
No,
there is
my
also the
theory is-
feeling of advertising executives who have sat around and tried to invent that, your character who doesn't know about the stock market, who is a Sid, and have delighted in the fact of producing this being. And it is an irritating idea that those people with their psychology degrees have worked out ways of almost patronising 3/4 of the population. Because when you watch it, don't you also have the sense, you are quite right in what you say, but don't you dislike being reminded in that way that you are a Sid rather than a Nigel by people who themselves are really Sids but believe themselves to be Nigels?
Yes,
But it is, after all,
putting it mildly, mate.
It is, after all, a name which someone else, not you, possesses. It's someone else even more humbly placed in this tiny little ladder of financial insecurity than you.
But Laurie's point that it's all invented by Sids who are passing themselves off as Nigels. Bear that in mind.
But I think it's cheering, because here is this huge advertising organisation which has got it wrong, which has simply got it wrong. And the fact that they can get it wrong is, to me, terribly cheering, because in a sinister way they seem to have been getting so many things right.
They haven't got it wrong, you see. Here we are, everybody is talking about it.
Just so, Edward.
You know, that it has worked as advertising, because they sat down and indeed, as you say, in a slightly patronising way, they've thought, what we're looking for is the guy who doesn't know anything about the stock market, but who likes a little flutter. That instead of on the dogs, they think, you know, do it on the British gas sale. Now, obviously, somebody called Nigel or Tarquin might also like a flutter, but I mean, he knows about the stock market, because it wouldn't work, obviously, if you said, you know, if you see Tarquin, tell him that he'd better get his prospectus now. So it's worked wonderfully. Everybody is talking about this Sid.
And I can add technical sort of evidence to what you say, Anne. Other advertisements advertising quite different things have taken up Sid and have added names like not only Sid, but Harriet and Caroline and Nicholas as well. And they're telling you exactly what you want to hear, that you aren't Sid, that you're someone rather nicer. And that's a very cunning way of using someone else's advertising
It does also exclude a large section of the population. Unless you exclude, I suppose, somebody reminded me the other day that only among black Americans was Sid popular in the 1980s because of Sidney Poitier. But the other thing is that Anne's point about the fact that it is working is one that you want to shout and scream against, because the fact that people spend hundreds of millions of pounds advertising so that you are forced to talk about it, you're forced to object to it, like that advertisement which comes on for Danish blue cheese, is because you want to stand somewhere and scream and shout, this is appalling, this is horrible, it is patronising, it's boring, it's deadening, I will never buy the product in my life. People say, you're talking about it, though. So therefore these psychologists sitting around the table in Southampton win.
Yes.
But I don't know whether it was absolutely wise of British Gas to bring in Sid, even though we're all talking about it, because you remember Joseph Kennedy, the rich man who founded that dynasty of Kennedys, and he was one of the few millionaires to get out before the 1929 crash, and this anecdote is told everywhere, and he was having his shoes cleaned sometime in 1929, and the shoeshine boy started to talk to him about the shoeshine boy's stocks and shares and this and that and investment strategy and all of that. And Kennedy, disagreeable man beyond compare, but shrewd, we'll have to allow, got up and thought, my goodness, if people like this are beginning to invest in stocks and shares, I better do something about it. And he went straight back to the office and sold a lot. And guess what the name of the shoeshine boy was? Sid. Oh yeah. Let's have a bit of a song. But goodness me, it was almost as though I struck a tuning fork. It was my water glass here. Sorry, lads, didn't mean to give you the note, but we're going to have something now from Instant Sunshine called I Spy.
When I became a spy, I found it hard to lie and shame the old school tie, despite my misspent youth. But spying soon changed my life. I so enjoyed the high life of speedy cars and caviar and sipping iced vermouth. My bills were astronomical. I became more economical with the truth. For years at MI5, I learned how to survive, to wheedle and connive as a cloak and dagger sleuth, with half-truths and evasions, destabilizing nations and extracting vital blueprints like a dentist pulls a tooth. Like Bond, suave and ironical, I'm always economical with the truth.
As British spies we have our pride, for British influence is wide, even though the empire died and is long gone. We have nothing we need hide, and we won't let down the side, just once we can decide what side we're on.
I've been a useful mole and played a subtle role, in the shade yet in control, never blasé or uncouth. I always try to pander to the rival propaganda, And like MPs who prove black is white outside a polling booth, I can prove the world is conical by being economical with the truth.
Tell us all about it. Well, tell us as much as you feel you can, anyway.
I write one book a year that's garbled and unclear, and which governments all fear. May expose more leaks and cracks. Hardback with bright dust jacket, it brings me in a packet. And with the bribes and slush fund cash, it helps me pay my tax. But in my annual chronicle, I'm always economical with the facts. Now retired to Red Roof, it's really frightfully comical. I'm no longer economical with the truth.
Here we are then. Now, that little ditty, admirable as it was, composed and sung, good lads. Who was playing the mouth organ? Oh, yeah, David Barlow. Yes, he's got it there in his top pocket. Now, that little ditty reminds us that there's an awful lot of lying going on just at the moment, and it doesn't matter whether you call it being economical with the truth. They sent that beautifully to music, that phrase. Or terminological inexactitude. Lying is what it actually is, and I just wondered whether the rest of you shared my primitive horror of the lie.
Yes, there is. Whenever you tell a lie, you do something to upset or to put almost to drop a stitch in the fabric of communication, don't you? That you mess it up for everybody else, and you also start something which often doesn't stop there, which reverberates. And so the idea of a tissue of lies, the idea again of how it spreads out from that simple little knot. So I would almost be very moral about it and say that if the way in which lying is now accepted and the names that we have for lies, all those words like white lies and lies of tact, that this won't do, and that perhaps that the lesson of watching people struggling in Australian courts, or the lesson of being reminded of Nixon at the moment by Ronald Reagan, is the idea that we should perhaps address the possibility of telling less lies, of consciously trying to tell lies, for the one other reason that whenever we are rather pleased with ourselves for telling lies, it is invariably because we fail to consult the person who has been the recipient of that lie, and that the victims, whenever they're talked to and said, aren't you glad that the doctors lied about, the fact that you had this or didn't have that disease, or aren't you pleased that you were told a lie about whether your dress was attractive or not, invariably say, no, they were not at all pleased by the lie, and the only person who appears to be pleased by it is the person who told it in the first place.
I like to be lied to from time to time, because I don't want somebody to say, you do look an old rat bag today, even though I may. They might say,
tact isn't a lie.
Well, I mean, you could.
Tact is just being decent.
A phrase like, you can tell she can tell enough white lies to ice a cake. Obviously, if it goes too far, then it becomes insulting. But I think tact does involve a certain amount of lying. I think there are certain lies which are necessary for society to continue in a well-oiled way. I think.
Now, I'm talking about the ones that are called damn lie. I mean, that sort of lie. You're excused if you tell a lie on behalf of someone else, and you're entirely disinterested. So that's what you're.
Yes. Okay. Well, we'll go to why is there the primitive horror of the lie that you
why
say.
Not?
I think it is because human beings do have a desire for certainty, for some sure ground on which to put their anchors. And I think it's shown very much, very interestingly enough, actually, to do with professional spies. Remember Muggeridge, who knew Kim Philby very well, and who was indeed a spy himself, obviously a very bad one. But he said the trouble with intelligence work, which is really the professional trafficking in lies, is that it makes you enormously credulous, because you end up, you have a desire to believe something, and since there's nothing in that shifting sand to believe that you can be sure of, you fasten on anything, because human beings do desire an anchor somewhere, and somebody who is a professional liar is sometimes the most credulous person, because
but also,
they can't
what they do to the rest of us, if they get a chance, is to fictionalise, in the wrong sense of the word, fictionalise in the bad sense, fictionalise the universe, turn it into a kind of Scotch mist. You couldn't have a relationship with a professional liar.
I'm doomed to write, and people laugh sometimes, and I laugh myself sometimes, to write endless autobiography. And this is only because I would love to write fiction, but I'm actually terrified of writing fiction because while I write something that I actually call false fiction or false autobiography, while I can hang on to what I know to be certain verifiable facts, I feel a kind of honesty about me. But once I let go of those, I would be terrified that I would, in the interests of fiction, tell absolute lies. And I think I may, in my case, have this strong and I think probably neurotic feeling about it from the fact that the family I grew up in told lies. But they told, it was generally, I think, except I think in a way we're being absolute about this, because lies mean, I think in the case of the family I lived in, a larger family, that they didn't give accurate accounts of what happened, probably because they didn't believe it was possible. So there was a kind of acceptance of falsehood or inaccuracy. I used to sit there as a small boy, listening to my uncles talking, and actually being myself able to verify from just common observation that most of what they were saying was not true.
But Edward, you seem to be tilting at windmills in a search for certainty on this subject. Anne spoke of, the reason we have a horror of lying is because we want to be certain of things. But truth, facts, the world is not a paper parcel to be passed from one hand to the other. It's much people's communication, the recipient, the truth, and the sender, is much more like moving a piece of meat from one bowl of soup to another. It's inextricably bound up with the flavors, the thoughts, the sort of mind that it comes from and the sort of mind that it goes to. There is no such thing as anything else in the world.
That is not a lie, though. That is autobiography you're describing in a way.
Well, that's what I'm saying about Edward.
Well, right, we are all joined to the things that...
Edward's fantasy about autobiography is that it is in some way less false than fiction.
But Edward said an
interesting
thing about identity and holding on to it. I was brought up in a family where it seems to me, looking back, and it seemed to me at the time, the ultimate sin was to tell a lie, or what was perceived to be a lie. It seemed wickeder than anything else. And I was so imbued with that, I wouldn't have dreamed of lying to my parents, and it would indeed burden them with confessions until they might have said, with Mr. Samler out of the Saul Bellow book, do you have to tell me everything? But I had to. And the psychologists among you, and which of you is not, will say, here was a little boy who had such a tenuous, such a slight grip on his own identity that he felt if he ever departed from what he took to be the truth, he himself might disintegrate. I'm a bit better now, but not much.
Because you've got to talk about the ways in which lying does devalue the currency of life, because liars are freeloaders. Liars are people who not accepting responsibility for the truth at a certain number of points where other people are trying to accept responsibility for the truth is freeloading. It, in fact, is getting away with it all the time. And if anybody leans so heavily against the essential movement towards truth, which lies at the middle of every communication system. I mean, every communication system must be trying to talk the truth. Even if it's in novels or wherever, it is trying to talk a sort of truth.
Yes.
Anybody who leans against it and puts a sort of lying weight against that devalues it for the next person to come along.
I endorse you.
The most rigorous truth teller that we know, Dr. Johnson, whose most incredible stories are all taken by his friends as a acme of truth, because everyone knew that he was the most veracious man in the world, who said that you should never tell your servants to say you're not at home when you are, because it would encourage them to lie about more important things. Even his most famous remark, "Clear your mind," of Kant, is about the possibility of lying.
Yeah.
He says, wait. He says,
I'm only cheering you on,
He says, clear your mind of Kant, because you can say to someone, "I'm your very humble servant," and you know you don't mean it. You know you're lying. It's not falsifying. It's not denying, as Laurie would say, the whole nature of human discourse. It is, in fact, how human beings react to each other.
That's
they
right.
react to each other in a whole web.
I'm surprised you haven't
composed of fantasy.
You are
unreality.
kind enough to have left it to me, because you could have said it yourself. That Dr. Johnson also, on the subject of lying, said, if a murderer should ask you which way a man has gone, you are under no obligation to tell him. But that's the right sort of lie. It's tact. You're helping. It's consoling. And you're entirely disinterested.
The Talmud has three areas where it says, rather interestingly, where they're interesting, 3 areas where it says that lying can be allowed, which I thought were interesting ones, which are referred to as tractate, bed, and hospitality. That tractate refers to the fact that you can, at certain times, lie about how much you know, about your wisdom about books, about what you know about Johnson or whatever, in order not to embarrass other people who know less than you do. Bed you may lie about.
Don't get a lot of that round here, do you?
Bed you may lie in order to protect your marriage, in fact, not to talk about your marriage. And hospitality you may lie about in order to protect your host and the host's feelings. And those seem to me to be 3 areas, all of which, in, as it were, reverse the normal scope of lying, which is for your own benefit.
What I'm saying about Royce really is that I totally agree that the distinction, a clear distinction has been made between a lie and a failure to establish the truth about something. One, a simple thing, verifiable, you could point the finger at it, and one, a bigger thing. But I don't think they can be distinguished as clearly as all that. I mean, I think only in the very simplest circumstances is it possible to say that is a lie, where in fact you say that the man is tall when he's short, or something of that nature. But once you've passed a very simple order of statements, which can be pointed to as obvious, plain lies, after that you enter a field where it is not so easy to say what is a lie.
It's not easy.
No, I'm just going to say, when talking about bed, I thought you were talking about not having read the Talmud lately. I think it's about when you're in love with somebody, and you know that being in love is actually a very deceitful thing, and that you know the other person is a liar. I mean, the Shakespeare thing which says, when my love swears that she is made of truth, I do believe her, though I know she lies. And that is great fun at the beginning, because it is a sort of game. But then later, of course, you do want that person to be truthful. And I think the worst thing about adultery, as a girlfriend of mine said, she said, I've given up adultery. And I said, why? She said, I cannot go on uttering lies about being late at the office. It wasn't the adultery that was getting her down. She quite enjoyed that. It was the lies that were so corrosive.
It seems to me that there's a beautiful example of good lying in Moliere's Misanthrope, where the misanthrope himself, the man who despises everyone else in the play, is criticizing a poem and doing it as if he was addressing himself to a third person, and says, well, if I had a friend who wrote like that, I think I would say, such and such and such. And the poet says, you think it's awful? He said, well, I don't say that. He, in fact, is doing what P.G. Wodehouse would describe as putting the truth on a plate, but with watercress round it.
But you are talking about what that illustrates about human character or about human nature. But if Edward is saying for moments at times that there is this confusion which arises when you move away from absolute notions of lying, but much of that confusion could be dissipated. I mean, it is a moral statement to say that there are occasions when, for example, in doing something so simple as providing references or assessments for students, that rather, in fact, than in going in for lying or white lies, which in fact perpetuate to such an extent that a whole series of euphemistic structure eventually is arrived at in which everybody is lying, that in fact that you can attack that and do something about it. It's quite true. I remember Shelley Berman once talking about someone who'd taken their child to a psychiatrist and said their kid was a liar, what could they do about it? And the psychiatrist said, don't worry, they can make a very good living when they grow up drawing up airline schedules.
Anne Leslie, Edward Blishen, Stephen Oliver, and Professor Laurie Taylor were stopping the week with Robert Robinson. Instant Sunshine provided the musical interlude, and the program was produced by Michael Ember.